I agreed to answer the call and left the operating room. When I entered the office, the receiver was lying on the desk. "This is Dr. Crenshaw. May I help you?" "This is President Lyndon B. Johnson," the voice thundered. "Dr. Crenshaw, how is the accused assassin?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The very first thought I had was, how did he know when to call? Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Connally, and if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription today. We are in part 3 of our walk through portions of Dr. Charles Crenshaw's book, JFK Conspiracy of Silence. He was one physician at Parkland Hospital, and he happened to operate on both men, John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963, and also Lee Harvey Oswald on November 24th, 1963. When we went through the first 2 episodes of this series, both involved the treatment of President John F. Kennedy. So if you missed those, you'll want to go back and see those. This is part 3, where President Kennedy is gone, and now we are going to see what happened after that. So Governor Connolly is still in the hospital, so we'll hear a little bit about his treatment, but then primarily today's episode will be focused on the treatment of alleged assassin Lee Harvey Oswald. I also wanted to let you know the next episode that you can look forward to is a walk through the 6th floor Depository Museum. I went through it about 6 months ago with my husband. He took me for our anniversary last fall, and I just have not gotten around to making a video of that experience, but I have done that now, and so you and I will go through that together. I hope you'll come back and join me for that. It's a wonderful look at the presidency and then the events that led to the assassination itself, with various interesting pieces of evidence and looks at the potential for conspiracy even that are exhibited in that museum. So I hope you'll come back and join me for that. And let's go ahead and finish out this book now together. This is at 2:30 p.m., only an hour and a half after the president has been pronounced dead. I went up to operating room 5 on the 2nd floor to watch Doctors Robert Shaw and James Boland and James Duke, which is a professor of surgery and 2 residents in thoracic surgery, operate on Governor Connolly's chest. Diagnosis of his thoracic condition was a single gunshot wound to the chest with comminuted fracture of the 5th rib, laceration of the middle lobe, and a hematoma of the lower lobe of the right lung. After 1 hour and 45 minutes of surgery, another 2 doctors operated on the arm. Simultaneously, 4 doctors operated on the left thigh. I observed Dr. Osborne, who was operating on the arm, remove at least 5 bullet fragments from the governor's arm and handed them to Nurse Audrey Bell. A bullet fragment in the governor's left thigh was not removed because it was not a threat at this location. So at least 5 bullet fragments in his wrist, 1 in the thigh. Total operating time was 3 hours and 50 minutes. All surgery on Governor Connolly ceased at 4:45 p.m. From surgery, he was taken to the recovery room, where an intensive care area was established by partitioning the room with sheets. This was well before the sophistication of modern intensive care units and equipment. Okay, so that gives us the update on Governor Connolly. He is not in an ICU because they didn't have that sort of thing back then, but he has gone through sophisticated surgeries in multiple areas in a very experienced trauma room at Parkland. Then we get to 5:10 p.m. Although I was technically off duty, I stayed with Connally to help change the governor's dressings and monitor certain laboratory values. I had been closely following research into the coagulation problem of trauma victims. Because of my interest in this area of medicine, Dr. Shires allowed me to assist him on the governor's case. So I didn't realize this, actually, that he had also operated on Connally. It doesn't even say that on the front. So this was something that he was doing out of his own passion not because he was assigned and not even because he was on duty. He gives a little bit of information about the risks that the governor was under, but I'm going to keep the story going towards Oswald. There is a summary, and I have told you guys this. If you are even remotely interested in this story, you want to get the whole book, because I'll just show you. He gives a hour by hour, moment by moment account of various movements and happenings. For example, on these pages, he talks about the things happening with Captain Fritz in the police department. He talks about Oswald and what's happening with Oswald. He talks about Marina and Mr. and Mrs. Payne. He talks about President Kennedy's body in the casket. So he's giving the movements of all different players in the story according to the timeline. And then in a different font, he inserts his own actions. So it's very fascinating. But I do want to give you a very quick synopsis of the things that he has to say about the autopsy, because that feels really relevant to his expertise and his observations. He writes down point by point the things that the House Select Committee on the assassinations that was done in 1979, the things that they charged happened during this time. He also goes into an extensive discussion of the magic bullet, so-called, and the bullet fragments. So again, if you want that kind of information, you're going to want to purchase this book on your own. I am not going to read all of that, but I do want to let you know that he does deal extensively with those things about where bullets were found and the various locations. So it is a very worthwhile read, very fascinating. And like I said, he does this moment by moment thing that is very useful for remembering what's happening in the story in between the parts that he observed. Now we get back to him that evening. It says, before heading for bed, I turned on the television for a few minutes to find out what was happening. All three networks were still on the air. He's at home now, by the way. For the first time, I saw Lee Harvey Oswald and heard how he had allegedly shot the president from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. When they showed the president riding in his limousine, waving to the crowd, it was hard for me to believe that I had, only hours before, watched him die and then embraced his mourning wife. As I shuffled to the bathroom in the dark, just as I had done 23 hours earlier, I was physically and emotionally exhausted. Too soon I would rise to begin another surgical shift that wouldn't end until Sunday at 9 a.m. I stopped and kissed my son on his forehead. Life was zooming by, but what could I do? I closed the door, turned on the light, and looked into the mirror. The face staring at me looked 10 years older than it had the previous morning. Very poignant. So he has a short sleep. And we go on to day 2, Saturday, November 23rd, 1963. He goes in to the hospital. What is your name, sir? A deep, polite voice boomed from the tall policeman. Dr. Charles Crenshaw, I replied. I'm a surgeon at this hospital. As I reached into my pocket to produce identification, Parkland's assistant administrator, who was standing beside the officer, nodded at him in confirmation, and I was allowed to pass. When I walked through the doorway, the scene in the hallway verified what I had suspected as I had driven on to Parkland's parking lot, that it was to be another unusual day. Automobiles bearing the markings of news organization, law enforcement departments, and state and federal officials were everywhere, as were the officials roaming between the hospital and the medical school, vigilantly patrolling the area. Still looming in the minds of the police was the concern of a conspiracy to kill Governor Connolly. I didn't realize that was part of what the concern was. That's interesting. Newsmen were frantically perusing the premises for an interview with anyone wearing a white coat. Police worried about security. Medical personnel were trying to provide health care. And the men in the suits were still lurking about, cultivating an aura of trepidation and intimidation. They always had the game face look of being perpetually pissed off. Dr. Crenshaw, tell me about the procedures that you performed on the president, a reporter asked, intentionally blocking my path toward the emergency room. Apparently, the news media had identified every doctor who had been in Trauma Room 1, and we were being searched out for interviews. Did he say anything before he died? Another reporter immediately asked. How many times was he shot? Someone else shouted, while more newsmen gathered around me. What is the condition of Governor Connolly? A voice demanded to know. Do you believe Oswald shot Kennedy in the back of the head from the Texas Schoolbook Depository building? A man with CBS inquired, as the cameraman behind him shone lights in my eyes. The question shocked me. Instantly, a scenario began to form in my mind, and the thought was terrifying. If Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin, they have a lunatic, a madman. But if I tell them the medical truth, that President Kennedy was shot from the front, they have more than one gunman. They have a conspiracy, I thought to myself. Then I remembered Agent Hill waving his pistol in Trauma Room 1 and how the men in suits had moved the president's body out of Parkland before an autopsy could be performed. How they would have shot Earl Rose and anyone else who had gotten in their way. How the president's limousine had been rushed out of view when the bullet hole in the windshield was noticed by the medical student. The people involved in this game played for keeps. For the first time, I sensed the presence of the pervasive influence of corruption, and it chilled me to the bone. Just as the film was about to roll, I replied, an official statement was made yesterday. I have nothing to add. Now, if you would excuse me. With that, I turned and threaded my way through the crowd of people toward the ER. At that moment, I entered the conspiracy of silence. Of course, that is the name of his book. And he's going to explain more about his thinking and decision-making in regard to keeping silent. I wasn't asked or told to do so, nor was any overt pressure ever placed on me. I was acting from an instinctive survival feeling, the one that had gotten me through medical school, through internship, and into one of the best surgical residency programs in the country. To do otherwise would have meant saying, hell no, Oswald didn't shoot him in the head because the president was shot from the front. None of us doctors were willing to do that. We all valued our medical careers too much. At a news conference in the hospital the previous day, Doctors Malcolm Perry and Kemp Clark suggested that the president must have been turning to his right when he was shot. They said this because they also believed that the bullet that ripped through President Kennedy's head had entered from the front. When the films showed that the president was not turned when he was shot, nothing more was said, as I remember. I didn't blame Doctors Clark and Perry one bit. They, too, had observed the men in suits and had heard about the scene with Dr. Earl Rose. Every doctor who was in Trauma Room 1 had his own reasons for not publicly refuting the official line. I believe there was a common denominator in our silence, a fearful perception that to come forward with what we believed to be the medical truth would be asking for trouble. Although we never admitted it to one another, we realized that the inertia of the established story was so powerful, so thoroughly presented, so adamantly accepted that it would bury anyone who stood in its path. I had already witnessed that awesome dictatorial force in the Earl Rose incident, the same fierceness that I would for years to come continue to recognize in the tragedies awaiting those people who sought the truth. I was as afraid of the men in suits as I was of the men who had assassinated the president. Whatever was happening was larger than any of us. I reasoned that anyone who would go so far as to eliminate the president of the United States would surely not hesitate to kill a doctor. Interestingly, if you want more information about that, there's a man named Penn Jones who took time over many decades to chronicle the assassination and the outflow from it on various witnesses. We reviewed a story. I will link it in the show notes, and this is the thumbnail that you were looking for. It talks about an article of over 100 witnesses who had something to do with the JFK assassination, who died in questionable or untimely circumstances. So that's something worth checking out. It wasn't that we doctors had an interest in disputing the one rifle, one man, one assassin theory. We're physicians, not police investigators, and detective work is not our business. But in this case, the medical evidence I saw overwhelmingly disputed the Warren Commission's claim as to the direction from which 2 of the bullets came that struck the president. Dr. J.J. Humes, the physician who performed the autopsy at Bethesda, called Dr. Perry, inquiring about the president's neck wound. Until informed, Dr. Humes was not aware that a bullet had entered the president's throat, only that a tracheostomy had been performed on that spot. After that discussion, we questioned the ability and qualifications of the team that performed the autopsy on the president. We heard reports that those doctors hadn't conducted an autopsy for years. And when I recently saw the official autopsy pictures, which we went through in the last episode, in episode 2, if you missed that. When I saw the official autopsy pictures, I knew something had been askew. If a post-mortem examination had been conducted on President Kennedy at Parkland, more questions would have been raised, and the autopsy pictures would have told a different story, one that would have led the investigation in other directions. I've often wondered what would have been the consequences of looking directly into the camera and boldly stating, President Kennedy was shot in the head and in the throat from the front. Now, after all these years, I realize that such courage would have been utterly ineffective and suicidal. The truth, staring directly into the face of our government, stood about as much chance of coming to light as a June bug in a hailstorm, and I wouldn't have fared any better. Already, the Eastern press had begun to discredit us as physicians and Parkland as a hospital. If you had any association with Dallas, you were suspect. Yeah. To come forward and give an unwavering professional opinion that was contradictory to the official story would have only given them a personalized target. I never understood why the government didn't behave in the same manner, why the press wasn't equally critical, or why the American people didn't condemn Los Angeles when Robert Kennedy was killed, as they had Dallas when President Kennedy was assassinated. That's interesting. I have always heard terrible things about the foaming hatred of Dallas, and I've never heard that about LA. The hospital administration was paranoid about publicity, especially at a time like that. In view of all I had heard, seen, and sensed, I wasn't about to appear on the 6 o'clock news giving an interview about the death of the president. A nursing student had already fallen into disfavor and was later thrown out of school because she informed the press of the number of blood units Governor Connolly had received. Although no official instructions had been issued by the hospital administration, there was a tacit implication, an unspoken warning in their general attitudes that said anyone who was intelligent enough to pursue a medical career was also smart enough to keep his mouth shut. So it goes on throughout that day, and he tells about his role in the ER. He's checking in on various patients. There are various traumas and tragedies happening. And he keeps doing this, but we're going to skip ahead again to get to the Lee Harvey Oswald part. It says, before I went back to the second room, I walked around the emergency room, marveling at the small number of people who were being treated. With so few cases, the chances of getting a good night's sleep were excellent. The president's death had almost brought Dallas to a complete halt. On my way back to the resident's call room, I took a quick detour into the anesthesia call room and saw, again, Oswald on television. A reporter was speculating that President Kennedy had been shot 3 times by Oswald from the Texas Schoolbook Depository Building, and that one of the bullets had gone through Kennedy's body and then hit Governor Connolly. When I heard that, I looked at Dr. Duke and shook my head in amazement. He returned the gesture. Again, I thought of the opening in the president's throat that was an entry wound. Later, when the magic bullet theory was propagated by the Warren Commission, I immediately concluded that no bullet would have had the energy to go through that much tissue, cartilage, muscle, and bone of 2 men and remain intact. Plus, I had seen the bullet fragments taken from Governor Connally's wrist. We knew that theory was ridiculous, but that was the story that was being disseminated. It later became the official story. So I do want to pause here before we get to the Lee Harvey Oswald part and just say that because he had observed the bullet fragments, we have to hold up the official story of the magic bullet that went through Kennedy, out, into Connally, out, into his wrist, out, and into the thigh. And we have to remember that this man, Dr. Crenshaw, who was a surgeon for 30 years, is saying, I saw at least 5 bullet fragments come out of the wrist And there was one fragment left in the thigh that was not in a dangerous spot, and they opted to leave it in. And I want you to look at the picture of the magic bullet and just ponder, does it show any damage at all? There's just a smushing of it. There are no missing pieces. So any thinking person has to say, either this man is lying or the magic bullet theory is nonsense. And for my part, I'm going with the experienced trauma surgeon at the end of his career in Dallas and Fort Worth, who has observed a bajillion bullet wounds. That's the official number, by the way. But in those two places, dealing with poor victims, not people who can pay out of pocket, but just average people who go in there after domestic violence incidents, after car accidents, after shootings, after stabbings. He knows what he's talking about. And he's saying there's no way, it's nonsense, and they knew it from the start. We've all got to deal with that and consider, what are we going to do with that information? Okay, so Parkland, 6 a.m. on Sunday, Day 3, November 24th, 1963. I awakened at 6 o'clock that Sunday morning feeling rested, a sensation that seldom came my way. For a resident surgeon, getting 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep ranks up there with a raise in salary. That makes me laugh. If you don't know, I'm a mother of a large family, and it makes me think about how you feel postpartum, that there is something totally different about the morning when you wake up and go, wait, the baby slept through the night. Oh my goodness. And you feel so refreshed and joyful, and you're like, don't breathe. Don't wake up the baby. I feel like he's the same. And I never knew that new mothers were having the same sensation as resident surgeons. The reporters had already returned to Parkland, and security was still tight. And of course, the ever-present men in suits were still there. He goes through his normal surgical rounds. He's checking in on people. He's keeping alert of any traumas that might need his attention, but he's also appropriately passing those on to first-year residents and others when appropriate. Later that morning at 11:24 a.m., it says, Parkland, we were standing in the hallway just outside Trauma Room 1 when Jack Price told us that Lee Harvey Oswald had been shot and was en route to the Parkland. I simply could not believe that we were about to treat the alleged assassin of President Kennedy. I noticed that several nurses were readying Trauma Room 1. In perhaps the most perceptive moment of my life, I turned to a nurse and exclaimed, in deference to President Kennedy, we will not treat this patient in Trauma Room 1. When Oswald arrives, put him in Trauma Room 2. At that time, we all assumed that Oswald was the killer of our president. Price's face lit up in agreement. Immediately, he recognized the long-term significance of that decision. For years, Jack Price has repeatedly expressed to me his appreciation that I had had the presence of mind to make that distinction. Word of Oswald's impending arrival traveled the hospitals faster than a staph infection. Dr. Ronald Jones was called out of surgery. He rushed down to join me and the rest of our group while we waited for the ambulance to arrive. Dr. Perry remained on the second floor to assemble a surgical team while the operating room was being readied. Having seen the shooting on television, Dr. McClellan rushed out of his Highland Park home and drove to the hospital. It's about less than 5 miles away, I think. And it's a very ritzy part of town, Highland Park. So he lived there, would have driven in. And when Dr. Shires heard the news on his radio, he turned his car around and headed back toward Parkland. So doctors are either in the building and going towards the ER, or they are in their homes or on their drive and returning to the hospital as fast as they can. 11:32 a.m., Lee Harvey Oswald is wheeled into the emergency room at Parkland. As Oswald was rolled into Trauma Room 2, he was deathly pale. I observed that he had dilated pupils, was unconscious and unresponsive, had no palpable pulse, but did have a heartbeat. The bullet had entered his left thorax, traveled through his body, and could be felt just under the skin on his right side. So so on this side. From his bloated abdomen, it was evident that his injury was causing him to continue to lose blood internally. We quickly cut away Oswald's clothing, underwear, and all. Then, while Dr. Jenkins inserted the endotracheal tube, Drs. Colne, Gustafson, and I performed 3 venous cut-downs, one on each leg and one on the left forearm. I did the one on the right ankle. So he's in virtually the same position he was with President Kennedy. And they're performing this cut down procedure, which he described earlier in the book, which was with a larger mechanism, more like the size of a pencil lead, to get increased volume of bodily fluids into a body that was in dangerous condition. Without delay, we initiated Ringer's lactate, then got O-negative blood flowing into 2 cut downs. In violation of hospital's policy, but as a measure he believed he had to take if Oswald was to have a chance of surviving, Dr. Red Duke had sprinted to the blood bank and collected an armful of O-negative blood and returned to the emergency room without documenting the withdrawal. O-negative blood is a universal type and can be given to anyone. I believe that demonstrated the effort we all made to save the man. Simultaneously, Jones inserted a chest tube and connected it to a closed water seal drainage bottle to prevent Oswald's left lung from collapsing. A blood sample was sent to the blood bank for immediate typing. The front of the gurney was lowered to help get blood to his heart and brain. Interesting, so to make his head lower so that blood could flow there more quickly. And Dr. Risk catheterized him. In record time, only 7½ minutes, we had completed the resuscitation procedure and had him on his way to surgery. We all sensed the significance of saving Oswald. Getting him up to surgery was like a fire drill. At least a dozen of us, entangled in tubes and equipment, pushed the gurney, plus IV stands and an anesthesia machine down the hall and squeezed into a small elevator. On our way up to the surgery, we suddenly stopped on the first floor. As the door opened, 2 of Oswald's friends who were on their way to the emergency room came into full view. They never knew it was Lee Harvey lying on that cart because all they saw was a mass of humanity and equipment. Once on the second floor, we rushed Oswald into the operating room. Doctors McClellan and Shires had not yet arrived, but did so just minutes after the operation began. As we prepared to open Oswald's abdomen, Dr. Duke arrived with a pasteboard box full of type-correct blood units, A1, RH negative, which were administered under pressure through the 3 cut downs. So they had the O-negative blood, which was universal blood type. Now they've switched to the type correct blood units and are administering those through the cut downs on the left leg, right leg, and left arm. I will never forget Duke continuously circling the operating table, carrying that box of blood. Around and around he went, IV pole to IV pole, replacing empty bottles with full ones, while tube bowls were being squeezed to increase the volume of fluids going into Oswald's circulatory system. If we hadn't had large amounts of blood entering him through the cut-down veins before his abdomen was exposed, his remaining blood volume would have quickly emptied when the incision was made, and he would have bled to death in only seconds. At 11:44 a.m., 12 minutes after Oswald had been admitted to Parkland, Dr. Perry made a midline abdominal incision that began just below the sternum and extended almost to his pubis. When the peritoneum, an envelope-like lining in the abdomen, was cut, 3 liters of liquid and clotted blood, 3/4 of Oswald's volume, almost 1 gallon, gushed from his abdomen like water from a bursting balloon. It went everywhere, on the sheets, on the floor, on us. Whew, you guys, this is such a picture. When the pressure in the abdomen was released, the remaining blood in Oswald's body began rushing into his abdomen through numerous portals. As I held a retractor with one hand and suctioned blood from the abdominal cavity with the other hand, Dr. Shires assessed the internal injuries. In a split second, a piece of lead, smaller than a thimble, would have done no less harm to Oswald's abdomen than would several blows with an axe. The bullet had lacerated the aorta and vena cava, which is the large vein running from the abdomen to the heart, shattered the spleen, slashed through the stomach, pancreas, kidney, liver, and finally lodged in the right lateral body wall. It did about as much damage to the vital organs as one shot can do. My goodness. I didn't realize that many organs had been damaged. Did you? Blood was running and squirting into the abdomen through each of the wounds, especially the spleen, aorta, and the vena cava. Doctors Shire, McClelland, Perry, and Jones were attaching clamps and applying finger pressure to the arteries, veins, and organs to stop the bleeding before they could begin repairing the damage. The scene that day was equivalent to preventing a boat from sinking when it's taking on water with part of the crew bailing and the others plugging holes. After the major bleeding had been brought under control, I looked up and took a deep breath. When I did, I spotted a large man across the room whom I did not recognize. He resembled Oliver Hardy in a scrub suit with no mask. Most alarming, there was a pistol hanging from his back pocket. If it had fallen to the floor, it could have discharged and killed someone. I never knew how he got into the operating room or who gave him the scrub suit. Just 2 days earlier, a Secret Service agent had rushed through the emergency room waving a gun as the President of the United States lay there dying. Incredibly, the man who had been accused of shooting President Kennedy was now lying before me fighting for his life, while another pistol-packing intruder looked on. I didn't know what to think except that we had to get a cap and a mask on that SOB before he contaminated the entire room with bacteria. I motioned for one of the other resident surgeons to relieve me. I scrubbed out and got the proper attire for the guy. I wanted to throw his ass out of the OR, but I was afraid he would shoot me. Without saying anything, I handed him the cap and mask. He put it on without comment. As I was turning around, a nurse tapped me on the shoulder and asked if I would take a telephone call in the supervisor's office. She had chosen me to take the call because I was head of Surgical B, the team that began the operation. You might remember from the beginning of the book, they were divided into Team A, Team B, and Team C, surgical teams that were on call for additional hours each week. He was Team B, and that's why he was there, and that's why he was the one tapped for this call. I agreed to answer the call and left the operating room. When I entered the office, the receiver was lying on the desk. "This is Dr. Crenshaw. May I help you?" "This is President Lyndon B. Johnson," the voice thundered. "Dr. Crenshaw, how is the accused assassin?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The very first thought I had was, how did he know when to call? "Mr. President, he's holding his own at the moment," I reported. "Would you mind taking a message to the operating surgeon?" he asked in a manner that sounded more like an order. "Dr. Shires is very busy right now, but I will convey your message. Dr. Crenshaw, I want a deathbed confession from the accused assassin. There's a man in the operating room who will take the statement. I will expect full cooperation in this matter," he said firmly. "Yes, sir," I replied and hung up the telephone. I almost laughed in the president's ear. If he could have seen the mess in the operating room and the condition of our patient, he wouldn't have asked. As I stood there in a state of disbelief, my mind was racing. First, deathbed confession implies that someone is going to die. If Oswald doesn't die on the operating table, is Oliver Hardy or someone else going to kill him? Second, anyone who knows anything about Texas politics is familiar with the 1948 U.S. Senate race when Johnson defeated Coke Stevenson and the election improprieties that were documented in South Texas. It occurred to me that if a dead man could vote in Duval County then, and they were documented as having done so there again in 1960 during the presidential election, why can't a dead man confess to a murder in Dallas County? And finally, why would the President of the United States personally call the operating room at Parkland Hospital and ask for a deathbed confession? That question still puzzles me. Why wouldn't someone with the Dallas police or the FBI make that request? Then more questions followed, inquiries that had frightening, inconceivable answers. I rushed back into the OR and approached Dr. Shires. There was blood everywhere, and 5 sets of hands were working in Oswald's belly. "You won't believe who I just talked to," I said to Dr. Shires. He looked at me with a "what's next" expression. "President Johnson would like for us to allow that man over there to get a statement from our president." Shires glanced at Oliver Hardy, shook his head in disbelief, and returned his attention to the operation. I wish that I could have taken a picture of him as he stood there, covered in blood. It would have been worth an entire library of words in expressing our efforts to save Oswald. Under the best circumstances, it would have been days before Oswald could have spoken lucidly to anyone. It was ironic. We had a patient on the table under oxygen anesthesia, bleeding to death from a bullet that had penetrated almost every organ in his body. And the President of the United States wanted the intruder with the gun to conduct an interview. The fact that a stranger was in the OR during surgery, something that would never have been tolerated, best illustrates the hospital's state of confusion at that time. Only moments later, at 12:37 p.m., almost 1 hour into the operation, Oswald's heart began to fail. Dr. Aiken's anesthesiology resident reported to the operating team that Oswald's cardiac condition was weakening and that his pulse rate was slowing. Electrical impulses on the cardioscope confirmed the sudden development. Dr. Shires placed his hand under Oswald's diaphragm to detect heart activity. As everyone looked on in silence, Dr. Shires shook his head and told Dr. Perry that Oswald's rhythmic cardiac activity had stopped. I walked over to our visitor with the gun and remarked, "There won't be any deathbed confession today." Like Clint Hill, Oliver Hardy disappeared and I never saw him again. Dr. Perry grabbed a scalpel and cut open Oswald's chest by making an incision between his ribs, exposing the heart. 2 injections were immediately administered directly into the heart, as additional drugs were added to IVs. To overcome the adverse effects of the acid of anaerobic metabolism that had invaded the blood from hemorrhagic shock, we were perfusing Oswald's system with medication. Only moments later, he went into ventricular fibrillation. His heart was quivering like jello. While waiting for the voltage to build on the defibrillation machine, Dr. Perry began manual cardiac massage. To no effect, Dr. McClelland pressed the paddles to Oswald's trembling organ and administered a jolt of electric current. Again, he embraced the heart with the conductors and applied a shock, this time stronger than the previous one. The muscle jumped, but it was to no avail. In spite of escalating the voltage each time, Dr. McClelland could not restart the heartbeat. Dr. Perry again administered manual cardiac massage, but Oswald's color had turned blue because of the lack of oxygen. Dr. Shires examined his eyes. His lenses were opaque. It was 1:07 p.m., and Lee Harvey Oswald was dead. Any loss of life is tragic. The loss of this man's life is particularly tragic. For those of you who believe he was the lone assassin, I can see why you might not think that. But I think for every citizen, including those who believe he was the only assassin, we should all value truth. And this man's life and his continued life would have been one of our best chances at arriving at truth. Instead, his life was taken from him. For several moments, we stood there in silence, gazing at a dead man who had possibly taken the secrets and evidence of Kennedy's assassination to the grave. Outside of President Kennedy, this was the one patient we did not want to lose. We truly believed we had a chance to save Oswald. Had the ambulance that brought him to Parkland been furnished with equipment and emergency medical technicians to administer oxygen through an endotracheal tube and dispense Ringer's lactate through IVs, resuscitation could have occurred at the scene of the shooting. Oswald did not die from damaged internal organs. He died from the chemical imbalances of hemorrhagic shock. From the time he was shot, 11:21, until the moment fluids were introduced into the body through cut-downs at 11:40, there was very little blood circulating in Oswald's body. As a result, he was not getting oxygen, and waste built up in his cells. Then, when the fluids were started, the collection of waste from the cells was dumped into the bloodstream, suddenly increasing the acid level and delivering these impurities to his heart. When the contaminated blood reached the heart, it went into arrest, then cardiac arrhythmia, finally fibrillation. The drugs that were injected directly into Oswald's heart were intended to stabilize the muscle, but the damage couldn't be reversed. His heart had stopped and couldn't be started again. If Ringer's lactate had begun flowing into Oswald when the ambulance arrived at the police station, he would not have been without circulation for 20 minutes. The waste would not have built up in his cells, and his heart, in all probability, wouldn't have stopped. If today's emergency care had been available in 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald could have lived, because he would have been brought into the hospital in a more stable condition. All the damage caused by the bullet could have been repaired with every expectation of a full recovery. While the bullet was removed from Oswald's right side and turned over to the legal authorities waiting outside the OR, we began preparing to go downstairs to a conference room packed with journalists, eagerly waiting to get word on Oswald's condition. I gave Dr. Shires a clean white coat. His was covered with blood. We dreaded going into the news conference to report the death of President Kennedy's accused assassin. When we entered the room, our solemn glares told the story. Doctors are notorious for maintaining game faces, somberness, in the full view of adversity. But there must have been a clear message in the way we looked that afternoon. Those reporters knew Oswald was dead before a word was ever spoken. Dr. Shires walked to the microphone. We were standing directly behind him. He announced that the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, had expired at 1:07 while in surgery. That everything humanly possible was done to save him, but the adverse effects of hemorrhagic shock could not be overcome. Then Dr. Shires asked if there were any questions. Of all that had happened during those 3 days, the very first inquiry by a newsman in the first row may have topped it all. Listen to this. He asked, "Doc, is he dead?" From that moment on, my opinion of the press took a steep dive. Other more intelligent questions were along the lines of wanting to know if Oswald had said anything before he died and why he couldn't be saved. It's amazing to me that during those 3 days we treated hundreds of people who were wheeled into the ER, so mangled and torn that death should have been certain. But some, most of them, managed to live. Yet we could not salvage the life of the president or his accused assassin. For years, I have replayed our performance that weekend in 1963, and I keep coming to the same conclusion. Neither of them could be saved. Parkland had superlative surgeons, state-of-the-art equipment, and it was an early mecca of medical research for trauma. I'm convinced beyond any doubt that President Kennedy or Lee Harvey Oswald, in the same condition that we received them at Parkland, would have died in any hospital in the world. When Dr. Shires had concluded the meeting, I ducked out a back exit, headed for the parking lot. All the way to the car, reporters were at my heels, requesting an interview and barking questions. Ignoring all their attempts, I jumped into my automobile and drove home. That ends his part in the medical things that happened in this book. I do want to read a smidge of his conclusion, his epilogue. He says, "That the real story has not been told is a tragedy. In the case of the physicians and medical personnel at Parkland Hospital, the conspiracy of silence was a mixture of fraternal doctrine, naivete, fear, and career-mindedness. This career-mindedness can best be summarized in Dr. Charles Baxter's decree. We made an opening statement to everybody concerned that if anybody on the medical side ever made a dime off of the assassination, we'd see to it again that they never went anywhere in medicine, because that's how strongly we felt that this was a private thing. The true conspiracy of silence and the fraternal doctrine that gives it life is found more explicitly in the action and inaction of some groups and individuals connected in some way to the president's death. Included in, but not limited to, this association are the president's family and aides, The new president and his aides, government employees, military officials, the FBI, the Secret Service, the CIA, Texas law enforcement personnel, local and national news media, Dealey Plaza witnesses, Jack Ruby's and Lee Harvey Oswald's friends and acquaintances, as well as the military pathology team and its witnesses. Think of this collection of people, organizations, and events as a mass of spaghetti, each strand representing someone or something related to JFK's death. So entangled and convoluted are they that it's almost impossible to trace any one element or person to a conclusion. There is no beginning or ending, no clear path progressing to a final resolution, just more leads twisted around dead ends that disappear into a pile of confusion. That's an excellent summary of how I feel. As I read various accounts, I just think, even in this book, I've encountered details that I had never heard before. Many. I hope you have too. It's an interesting read, and on some level, we are doing an investigation that many people before us have done. People ask, well, why don't you just read Gerald Posner's book and get over it? Why don't you just, read Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment, and then you'll know everything you need to know. And the thing is, those books are fine, but each one of them are looking at original source documents and evidence, which is the same thing I hope to do. That by reading from the doctor, we're getting his words. By reading Jean Hill's account, we got her observations. And as we go through from, Jackie's assistant to Evelyn Lincoln's account to a book about Jack Ruby or Mary Meyer, my hope is that we will get increasing amounts of information and begin to sort out the pile of spaghetti for ourselves. That's my goal, but it does feel this way sometimes, that there's no clear path progressing to a final resolution. Even with the recent documents that have been dumped, I know people have said, Jess, are you going to read those documents? And I'll say this. I believe there are 80,000 pages of information, and if you have taken any time to look at all, you'll notice that it is a list of individual links without titles. It's not listed like Lee Harvey Oswald's visa application or, Secret Service member so-and-so's testimony. It's not listed that way at all. It's like a list of numbers with a dash and then more numbers. And you have to click on each individual document. So it feels like more spaghetti to me. It feels like more tangled mess rather than some sort of systematic, like, here are the 8 visa requests that he made, and here are all documents related to this event or to that government operation or to this person. They're not listed that way at all. And so it is a confusing tangle of a mess. So I do hope to get around to the documents, but the truth is that plenty of people are going through them and talking about those. And so I feel like we can go through evidence this way. And then as those documents become more clear, and as other people even highlight, hey, these are the 25 that are most significant, then maybe we can review those together. Many of the people in these groups knew they were telling lies that were accepted as facts. They knew that their silence was ordered. They knew evidence was fabricated, falsified, and destroyed. They knew that witnesses were intimidated, ignored, and inadequately interrogated. From the silence of the people involved came a great miscarriage of justice and an almost complete loss of faith by the American people in their government and its agencies. Due to their active or passive participation in the continuing cover-up, we are faced 28 years after the fact with the still unsolved murder of one of the world's greatest leaders. The assassination was a brutal action that changed our domestic and foreign policy and reshaped history. The individuals involved in this conspiracy of silence are neither heroes nor great Americans. At best, they may be considered cowards. At worst, co-conspirators or accessories after the fact. This conspiracy must end. That's his word about this, and he is admitting his role in the conspiracy of silence. So, what do you do with Dr. Crenshaw's testimony, his experiences of treating JFK, of observing the autopsy, of treating and observing the injuries of Governor Connolly, and then his experience of intaking, walking with, and observing the surgery of Lee Harvey Oswald and the death of Lee Harvey Oswald, as well as receiving that call from LBJ. Whew, that's a lot of experiences for one man to have, don't you think? His perspective on all of this is fascinating. I, for one, am thankful to read it. I'd love to hear in the comments what you think. Let me know. And next time, come back for that tour through the 6th floor museum together. I can't wait to show it to you. I hope you'll enjoy it with me. We'll see you next time. Bye.